I always try to recap and keep fresh in our mind what we've been going through over the last weeks. And I want to recap really quick that I proposed to you that God is like Jesus. I often point to Hebrews 1:3 that tells us that Jesus is the exact and complete imprint of who God is. Paul put it this way in Colossians 1:19, that in Jesus, the completeness of God is revealed. New Testament scholar James Dunn said that the importance of Paul's language here is to inform us that the wholeness of God's interaction with the universe is definitively summed up in Jesus. Some other thoughts that I've offered you along the way from various sources include one Anglican priest who put it this way: God is Christ-like, and in him is no unChrist-likeness whatsoever. And then C.S. Lewis, many people, their favorite author. I grew up on C.S. Lewis and I love him to this day. C.S. Lewis said this of Jesus: Jesus is all that God has to say. What's that? Which book? I believe that's in his letters. I'll double check for you. Combining these thoughts with our recent journey through the book of Ruth, we've landed where everything should bring us, to the feet of Jesus, to look at him and to get to know him better and better. And so in particular, right now, we've come to the life of Jesus, specifically as it's presented in the Gospel of Matthew. And coming to the Gospel of Matthew, we first realized that Matthew is retelling the First Testament. I think we have a recap slide if we can throw that up. I'll just quickly go through some of the recap. So Matthew is retelling the First Testament. Both the Hebrew scriptures that make up the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, and Matthew's Gospel. The Hebrew scriptures, remember, they were ordered a little bit differently. They begin with Genesis in the beginning, and the Hebrew scriptures that Matthew would have, they closed with the book of Chronicles. And the book of Chronicles ends with a declaration from King Cyrus, a kingly declaration to go and build the kingdom. So the Old Testament, as Matthew knew it, was bookended by a beginning and then a go out to build the kingdom. Matthew bookends his gospel with the word Genesis in Matthew 1:1, and he ends in Matthew 28 with a kingly declaration to go out and build the kingdom. Matthew bookends his gospel exactly how the Old Testament was bookended. And within Matthew's gospel, we find a replication of the First Testament that includes a division of 5 parts, just like the Torah. A law of God is going to be given on a mountain in Matthew's gospel, and an exodus out of Egypt is going to take place. There's more examples that we'll come across, but the ultimate lesson learned is that Matthew is teaching us that Jesus is and always has been at the center of it all. He's retelling everything from the sacred scripture and saying this is all about Jesus. Luke chooses to tell us this by the Emmaus Road story, where Jesus enlightens a couple of his disciples on the road. Let me walk you through the Hebrew scriptures, the First Testament, the Old Testament, and show you how it all led up to me. So in Luke, it's explicitly given in the story of Jesus and Emmaus. In Matthew, he teaches the same lesson by shaping his gospel like the Old Testament and making it all point to Jesus. So now we're referring to this book as the Gospel of Matthew, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the title, as we know it, the Gospel of Matthew, was given to the book much later. Matthew 1:1 is Matthew's title for his book. And it is the book of the new creation. He uses the word Genesis. The book of Genesis by Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And once we get past the overall layout of Matthew that reflects the First Testament, and we read Matthew's title for his book, we came to the genealogy of Jesus, our favorite material in the Bible. But quickly we realize that the genealogy that Matthew puts here is a little bit different. And it makes it interesting. It makes it unique. It's not a genetic progression through which we come to Jesus, because the genealogy gives us does not genetically connect us to Jesus. Instead, it's the progression of promises of God through which we are led to Jesus. In Matthew 1:17, Matthew divides up the legal line of Jesus by three key moments of promise. The promise to Abraham, that he would bless all the nations through him. The promise to David, that he would have an eternal kingship. And then the third division is the promise to the exiles, that he would not leave people in exile. And so this lineage of promise, it not only does it place Matthew's gospel as the Old Testament, pointing us to Jesus, but it also places now Jesus at the center of the promises of God. So last week then we jumped into the life of Jesus, and beginning with the events around his conception, we started to look at his life. And specifically, we took some time to give Joseph a chance to be human. Joseph is often neglected, I believe. And really it's because by the time Jesus is age 12, it's the last we see of Joseph. But it's so cool to add dimension to the characters in Scripture and realize they are human beings. And so we should have a slide about Joseph, what we went through with Joseph. We took into account the fact that wood was actually not readily available to build with in Israel. There was the fact that most of the buildings were built with stone. The fact that Joseph lived in Nazareth, where stone workshops have been found dating to his life. And Nazareth was positioned right next to a major stone quarry. And the Greek term for Joseph's occupation does not actually mean carpenter. I told you that Joseph was most likely a stonemason. This gives a whole new depth to all the passages around Jesus and God that refer to stone. It provides us with a background to Peter's letter that the God who came to earth and became a stonemason is now building a house with living stones. He knows how to work with stones. Beyond his occupation, we learn that Joseph was poor. And then we considered that he held a generous theology. A theology that was generous and that Jesus' life literally depended upon. Jesus was held in Mary's womb, and she wasn't pregnant by Joseph. It was a capital offense to not be pregnant by your husband. But Joseph, despite the hurt and the betrayal that he would have felt, he vowed that he would handle things with generosity. And he vowed that he would quietly release Mary from her commitment. So last week, we began to immerse ourselves in the life of Jesus, in the story of Jesus' life. And we made Joseph a little more human, I hope. This week, we're going to take a little detour. We're taking a detour to something that God's walked me through last week. And I've been continuing to process it. And so what happens when you have a single pastor here and you get what he has to give you is that sometimes his mind goes somewhere else and he just doesn't have time to write two things. And so we're going where my mind went. We're going to take a little detour. I'm continuing to process this, and that's a word of warning to you in advance that I don't have a nice, neat bow to wrap this up with. I don't have a nice, neat bow to draw things to a conclusion with yet. So therefore, what I'm doing is I'm handing you something to wrestle with, something that I'm still working through. At its core, this detour considers the question, how do we keep going when we feel broken, burned up, burned out? We keep going when we feel that way. Our detour begins with this understanding that through Scripture there's a pregnant thread of thought around living rocks. What I mean by pregnant is that there's There are these things about rocks and somehow they're alive. There's this thread of thought that at first it appears less than it is at face value. But it's actually set up to birth something deeper than what we initially see. A famous example of something that is pregnant is from the Gospel of John, when Caiaphas, he speaks of Jesus dying to prevent a revolution which will have Rome crush Israel. And he says, isn't it better for one man to die and in that way saving the entire nation from death? He was talking about a political ends, but he didn't realize his statement was pregnant with deeper meaning, that Jesus was literally going to die to save the people from death. So there's this pregnant thread through Scripture of living rocks. Rocks are the last thing I believe that we would associate life with. A rock in and of itself is usually understood to be pretty antithetical to life. A tree is alive, a bush is alive, a plant is alive, an animal, you and me. A rock is utterly opposite to anything that we picture about life. It doesn't grow. It's not, there's nothing there that's living. And yet through Scripture, there's the theme that life and rocks are somehow brought together, and you have these living rocks. The thread can be traced back in Scripture to at least the Exodus, where Israel wanders the desert. And in the desert, water is life. And miraculously, they are given life from a rock when they strike it. They find a rock with life in it. God can bring life to the deadest thing we can think of. This means that he can bring life to anything, any person, any circumstance where death seems the surest. God can bring life. So the rock is struck, and life is found in this rock where we'd think it's just death. Jesus is then called the living rock. And when he is struck, when he comes to earth, life is found in him. And we, Scripture says, are being built into living rocks. There is a thread that runs through Scripture of this, but it isn't all fun and games. In the army, they have this thing called smoking. It's not what you think. It's not smoking a cigarette or smoking something else. People in the army get smoked. What this means, for example, is that for punishment or correction, the army uses physical exercise. It's often done even as a group punishment. So you are often being forced to do something physical, push-ups, squats, some form of physical activity that over time can become painful and tiring, often for someone else's mistake. And you endure this physical activity as a punishment to the point of physical pain. And then, many times, even to the point of physical failure, where you just cannot do another push-up. This process is called being smoked. Someone is smoking you when they are telling you, more push-ups, you're being punished, let's go. When someone can't go on with the physical punishment anymore, when their body quits, they are smoked. Put a fork in them, they're done. They're cooked. They've been smoked. I was one of those ones who used to reply to getting smoked as I was doing my push-ups or whatever it was. Can't smoke a rock. In other words, I'm tough as a rock and I will not quit. You will not be able to smoke me to the point where I quit doing this. I will endure the punishment. I will endure the pain. I won't quit. There were several of us that had this refrain. As we're being punished, can't smoke a rock. But what you come to learn in life is that even if you can't smoke a rock, you can certainly break one. You can crush a rock. And despite my haughty attitude about being unsmokable, I had to learn in life that no one is unbreakable. There are times that are crushing. I went through such a time just a couple weeks ago. And I didn't know that when I spoke last Sunday of God coming to earth to be a stonemason, I didn't know that I was speaking on Sunday about God being a stonemason, setting the stage for this little detour of Bible study God would take me down about stones on Monday. Beautifully for me. So let me set the stage for this detour. The Jews have been carried off to captivity in Babylon. Their city is destroyed. The wall that protected them has been crushed. Their temple crushed. The Jews are carried off into captivity in Babylon. The Persian Empire comes along and they defeat Babylon. They now own everything Babylon owned, including the slaves. But under the Persian rule, the captives are allowed to go back home and rebuild. The Persians did things a little bit different. So some of the Jewish community that got displaced, they returned to Jerusalem to get things rebuilt a little bit, including the temple. But the rebuilding project kind of grinds to a halt. People begin to lose their motivation. They get distracted. And the rebuilding comes essentially to a stop. The temple's been built, but not much else. Not a city wall. Things remain that way for a while until Nehemiah is released from his job for the Persian king and is given permission to go lead the people in a renewed effort to rebuild, to get things going again. And a key focus of his is going to be rebuilding the wall. In the ancient world, the wall is what kept your city safe. The security of your life depended on these walls. So Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem to take the leadership of the people, and he successfully remotivates them to begin building the wall. This was not cool with others in the area who had moved in as the Israelites had been moved out by Babylon. This wasn't cool. They didn't want to see the Jews become successful again in the area. So with this really quick detour, with some of this information, this foundation for our detour, we begin in Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. This is Nehemiah talking. Now when Sanballat heard that they were building the wall, this is one of their enemies in the area. When Sanballat heard that they were building, this is Nehemiah talking, that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he mocked us. He mocked the Jews. He said in the presence of his associates and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it by themselves? Will they offer sacrifice? Will they finish it in a day? Will they revive?" In other words, will they bring to life the stones that lay in the heaps of rubbish? Burn stones at that. When a stone burns, it cracks. When a stone gets heated, it cracks. And so these stones have been crushed and they've been burned, they've been cracked, and now they lay in the rubbish. And so he says, are they going to bring these stones that have essentially, metaphorically, been killed into the rubbish pile? Will they bring these back to life? Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him. And he said, he elbowed him. And he's like, the stone wall they're building, any fox is going to go up on it and it's going to break. Now we come back to Nehemiah. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their taunt back on their own heads and give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt and do not let their sin be blotted out from your sight. For they have raged against the builders. And here's what Nehemiah says. So we rebuilt the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. They got some success going. Nehemiah was able to motivate them, and they became successful in their endeavor. At the focal point of this passage, as I'm reading it last week in my own painful state, the focal point of this passage for me are these stones. Specifically, it's these instruments that the Jews are building with. And these stones are broken, burned stones that have been crushed, laying in a rubble heap, laying there from the destruction of the city over 100 years ago. Sanballat has heard that the Jews, they have this idea that they are building something with a grand vision in mind. Sanballat is like, oh, these guys are building something with a grand vision in mind, and I'm going to go check it out and see what they're doing. And Sanballat comes out to see them grabbing pieces out of this rubble and working to build something with it. And he, with his buddy Tobiah there, they're laughing. Sanballat tells his buddy, do you really think they're going to build something worthwhile with that trash? And Tobiah laughs with him and says, right? I mean, look at that wall. They think that thing's going to protect them. Even a fox coming to raid a hen house is going to tear that wall down. In this dynamic, fighting over the stones, speaking about the stones that are laying there, you have two sides at play. On one side, you have the voice of Nehemiah. He's encouraging the people. Speaking of these stones, he's saying there's something here that's useful to work with. So on the one side, you have the voice of Nehemiah. On the other, negative side, you have the multiple voices of Sanballat and Tobiah. Because isn't that always the way it is? Isn't it always the negative that feels more, double the positive? Isn't that the way it feels? The multiple other voices say, look at the ruins of what you have to work with. Broken, burned down, burned out, pieces of what you used to be. I see the crap that you're going to work with. And you're delusional to think you can build something with it. Do you see where I'm going with this historical event? This incident in history is still for us. Last week, it was still for me. Because this event, it's not in our scriptures as if I somehow add value to my life by knowing that thousands of years ago, some people ended up being successful, putting together some rubble into a wall. Doesn't add a lot of value to my life to know that. But this event is in Scripture because a figural reading of Scripture believes that anything and everything I will go through can be and has been addressed somewhere in our sacred Scriptures. And when the right passage is read at the right time and in the right way, the Spirit of God will enlighten us with truth. Truth to what we're going through, truth about God. It lends truth to my feelings, and I realize that I am experiencing something that has been spoken of in Scripture. I'm experiencing being turned into a pile of crushed and burned rubble. And like the rubble pile, Sanballat and Tobiah are mocking. They're voices in my head that speak double the positive. And I feel ill-equipped to build into anything of worth what is left after a period of brokenness. But I'm pulled into this scripture by the Spirit of God. The story of some pitiful rocks back then in scriptures is there so that God can meet me in the truth of what is happening to me now and around me. And it's there to encourage me that something can be done when he's involved. This is the way Scripture is designed to work for us. I don't always feel like this living rock out of which life comes when it gets hit. Jesus is that rock. I would hope to be that rock. I'm a rock. You can't smoke me, and when you hit me, life comes out. I don't always feel that way, though. I can't always resonate with the thread of living rocks. But in the middle of this pregnant thread of living rocks, there's this pregnant moment of rocks that have been crushed and damaged, and Sanballat, the bad guy in the story, he prophetically wonders, can these rocks ever be revived? Can they be fixed into something again? Can these damaged rocks be made into living rocks? He speaks beyond what he even knows in the moment. And the answer to his question, because we have the whole story, we know that the answer to his question is yes. We have a God who came to earth and learned to work with rocks. He came to earth as a stonemason to prove his skill with rocks. He's used to working with rocks. And what appears to us to be the deadest of dead things, a rock, finds life in him. Have you seen sculptures from back in the day where Michelangelo and these other people, they bring life out of a rock? You see their sculpture and you're like, this is the hands of a craftsman. That is what God came to do. In a little while, as we get back on track next week, going through the Gospel of Matthew, we're going to come in a little while to John the Baptist. And he's going to pick up this idea of dead stones. Dead stones being brought to life, like what's being insinuated here in Nehemiah. And John the Baptist is going to say, don't you know, from those stones right over there, from what seems deader than dead, just laying over there, God can bring life. Here's the thing about carrying this analogy over to people, as I've been processing this. This wall was crushed and burned up, but it was built into something worthwhile. But many years later, it was broken down again. The Romans came back and they crushed it again. The single cycle that we find in history of these stones is one of many that we will find in the human experience. The human experience will be many cycles of being broken down and rebuilt throughout our lives. We are all going to be broken and burned. And this is going to happen to us over and over again. Paul records that he dies every day. People have ripped this out of context to make it some holy confession of Paul, that he is dying to himself and his desires, and he dies to his own self every day to live a holy life. It's not what Paul's saying. Paul speaks of his sufferings, the things that break us down. And Paul is saying, I'm like the wall in the book of Nehemiah that's being built and has been broken down and burned. And Paul says, I'm being broken down and burned, killed by suffering daily. And yet daily I also have God rebuilding me. This happens because 1 Peter 1, and I believe this one is on your page as well. 1 Peter 1 tells us that we are being protected by the power of God as we suffer our knocking down. Somehow Christianity has twisted it in our faith that the power of God protects us from crushing experiences in life, from suffering and burning. Christianity's twisted it. Somehow our faith is supposed to make us prosperous. And we're meant to live in mansions. We're supposed to have the best designer clothes, all the food we can eat. Because the power of God is meant to protect us from those things. But Paul says, I believe this is Romans 8:30. It's in Romans 8. It's in the 30s. Paul says that in our nakedness and in our famine, when we aren't prosperous, when we're suffering, in our nakedness and in our famine, in it, we are more than conquerors. Us being conquerors doesn't keep us out of it. In it, we will conquer despite it. We're going to go into sufferings of all kinds, is what Scripture tells us. But what we know is that we have a stonemason God who brings us to life each and every day, even as we are also dying every day. First Peter 2, we'll look at this really quickly. 1 Peter 2, it tells us how this works. 1 Peter 2, verses 4 to 5. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourself be built into a spiritual house. But essentially, let yourself be built. I referred to this passage last week in speaking of God as the stonemason who is skilled to build a house with stones. He's working on each of us as stones to put us together as one stone with another. But there's important words here in 1 Peter. Come to him and let yourself. Just come to him and let yourself be built. I get obsessed with doing the work with controlling it all. And yet I'm still going to get crushed and broken. I can't. First Peter says, here it is. Come to him and let yourself. What does coming to him look like? St. Simeon put it this way. I love how he put it. God is at work in all of us. Coming to him is the process about finding where he is at work in us. There's so many aspects of us, and God is at work somewhere in there all the time. And coming to God is the process of coming to him where he is in us. St. Simeon compares this idea to a pregnant woman who can feel her baby kick and move within her. There's something at work in her, and she can feel where it is. And St. Simeon says that this is the same way that we can find where God is at work in us. But just like with the mother, we can't see all the details. We can find where God is at work in us, but we'll never fathom the depths of his work, if I'm completely honest. I can find out where he's at work, but I'll never fathom the full extent of it. But like a pregnant mother, we can feel him moving and working in us. So we come to him, we identify where God is at work, and we meet him there, bringing him what is left of our rubble, our crushed and burned up pieces. And we come to him and we let him build. We bring and we let him build. That's what Peter says. But like the mother who's insisting that if we want to see her baby kick, we're going to have to slow down and pause for a second, or we might miss it. Wait, don't move. Ah, there it is. Did you feel it? It takes a pause. It takes a slowness to discover where the kick is happening, where the work is happening. Finding where God is at work, moving in us and working in us, requires often that we slow down. One of the greatest flaws that I've seen with the Pentecostal and charismatic sectors of Christianity, sectors in which I count myself somewhere in there. But one of the greatest flaws I've seen in the groups of Pentecostals and charismatics is their hunger, or even an addiction, to have a faith that's a 110 mile per hour experience. But I believe that in the rush for what seems wondrous, they often fail to slow down to see what's wonderful. The pause. To get in tune with where God is really working. I dare say that we all have fresh and old rubble piles of crushing moments through life. Places where we've been knocked over, burned up, burned out. But God is at work bringing life there. Sambalot said, is this builder, are they really going to bring life to those stones? And God says, yes, I'm proving that I will. God is at work. This is contrary to the double amount of negative voices, inside or outside, that want to doubt what is and what will happen. I want to invite you to slow down now, through the rest of this service, or later when it works for you. When you can find the ability to slow down, I want you to invite you to slow down. And I said, St. Simeon said as possible, work to sense, where is God in me? At work. Where is God bringing my crushed pieces back to life and building them into something worthwhile, into something that what ultimately happens to the wall that Nehemiah is building is that it will be strong enough, not a mere fox is going to knock it down. It takes a Roman legion. It was strong. So slow down. Come to where God is in you. As Peter says, come to him and let him build. Come to where he is working in you and bring your pieces and let him pick the pieces of rock up and dust them off and begin to build. It'll require some stillness, though, and some slowing down. But God will make you a living stone. He will bring life to many of the areas where we feel it's the deadest of dead, the dead can be. He will bring life to there. Because all God is life and light and love. And in him, he's promised there's no changing from that. There is no turning from what he is. There is no darkness in him at all. He is the living rock. He is the rock that when struck, life comes out of it. So slow down now. Slow down later. I don't know when you can take the time, but please slow down and look for God at work in you.